Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's On Demand Virtual Care, which allows patients to see a provider from their home using a computer or smartphone with on demand care for common ailments such as a cough, sore throat, or a sinus issue. More information at stlukesonline.org.
The West is in a snow drought, mountain areas delayed opening, and limited ski runs. But nonprofit recreation area Bogus Basin has a secret weapon against the warming conditions.
I talked to the snowmakers and I was like, just start making snow up there. And we picked a spot. We called it Project X. We just made a giant pile of snow.
I'm Jamie Geary. How Bogus Basin opened with snow stored last season. Listen on BoiseStatePublicRadio.org.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Cotet. This is Idaho Matters. It's Friday, which means it's time for our Reporter Roundtable. We will get you updated on the news that made headlines this week. And today, our panelists include Clark Corbin with the Idaho Capital Sun, Logan Finney with Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television, and Sarah Cutler with the Idaho Statesman. Hi, everybody, and happy Friday.
Hey, Gemma, happy Friday.
Hi there.
So today we are going to start with the legislative session and the budget, because a wave of tax cuts and revenue uncertainty may finally be catching up with our state. A new budget memo, in fact, asked public schools and Medicaid to plan for possible cuts, despite earlier promises to protect those programs. So, Clark, let's begin with you. What specifically changed between lawmakers promising to protect K-12 funding, but now asking schools to basically prepare for cuts?
Yeah, thanks, Gemma, for sure. I appreciate it. I think what's changed is we've gotten a little bit farther into the new legislative session, and some key legislators are really starting to grapple with the cost of complying with some of these federal tax changes that were approved last year, and the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that President Trump signed into law last summer. I think that for a long time, Governor Little in particular had told public schools that he was going to exempt them from budget cuts, and he did. The first round of budget cuts that were approved last summer to avoid a budget shortfall in the state of Idaho did exempt the public schools. But I think what's changed is now we're in the legislative session, and these new cuts of up to 2% that Idaho's K-12 public school system and Medicaid program are having to submit plans for, those are a new type of cuts that would be in addition to the 3% cuts from last summer. And so, yeah, I think what's changed really is the baton has sort of been passed from the governor to the legislative branch when it comes to setting the budget and putting forward a plan to avoid a budget deficit. But I think that they're looking at full compliance with some of these federal tax changes that President Trump and Congress approved, even going back retroactively on some of these tax cuts, whereas Governor Brad Little had proposed basically making the tax cuts effective January of 2026 moving forward instead of retroactively, which is going to be more expensive and is going to remove more revenue that's available to pay for programs out of the state budget. So I think a couple of different things have changed, but the big change is that you're absolutely right. After months of saying they were exempt and protected, now the public school system has been asked to plan to submit plans for new budget cuts of up to 2%. So those are the big changes there, Gemma.
So, Clark, you mentioned some federal policy. So, do we know how much of this budget uncertainty was actually tied to Idaho's own tax policy decisions versus those unknown impacts of the federal One Big Beautiful Bill Act that passed last spring?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jim. And I think it's really both of those things coming together to affect the budget. For a couple of months before the legislative session, I know I was coming on Idaho Matters and talking to you about the projected budget deficit. So that was all before the impact of these federal tax changes. That was all a result of some of the tax cuts passed at the state level. Last year, the state passed about $450 million worth of new tax cuts and tax credits altogether. But over the last 5 years, the state has passed somewhere around 4 billion with a billion dollars worth of tax cuts, many of them income tax cuts. And what that does is that's reduced the amount of money available to pay for programs in the state budget. That was some reporting and reports that were put out by the nonprofit Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy. It talked about the impact of the state level cuts. So I think you're exactly right, Jim. It's two things coming together. It's 5 years worth of tax cuts passed at the state level by the Idaho legislature being
Mm.
combined with the federal tax cuts that President Trump and Congress approved last summer. Both of those would reduce revenue available for the state budget. And I think both of those are fueling this budget crunch, this budget uncertainty that is kind of dominating the 2026 legislative session to this point.
Okay, so Clark, if these cuts actually move forward, right? And
Yep.
you said that they're looking at 2% reduction, right? So
Yeah, up to
do we know
2%.
real Okay, so do we know realistically, like I'm talking on the ground, what that would look like for our public schools for Medicaid recipients?
We don't yet. We know a dollar amount that's estimated. And so when we talk about what does 2% mean in terms of dollars and cents, it looks like it's about $55 million for public schools and about $19 million for Medicaid. But in terms of how does it look at your local school, how does it look for someone who is benefiting from Medicaid services and programs, we don't know yet because state legislators asked officials to submit plans for the cuts, and they are due at noon today. So just about 10 minutes ago, these were
Mm.
submitted. We're hoping to get a look at some of this information maybe later today, maybe early next week. But that will be the next piece, is to find out specifically what would these cuts look like. And I don't have specifics, but I've talked to legislators from both political parties, Ben Furman, a Republican, and Janie Ward Engelking, a Democrat, who have worried that because we are late in Idaho's fiscal year, it ends at the end of June. They have expressed concern that due to the lateness of these new budget cuts coming, them having to take effect in the middle of the year, essentially as a holdback, those two legislators were worried that that could mean furloughs for state employees. We don't have a specific proposal in front of us, but that's some of the concern this week, Gemma, that I've heard coming out of the Idaho State Capitol here.
Okay. So, Logan, in the middle of all of this happening at the State House, the Idaho Supreme Court heard oral arguments about Idaho's new parental choice tax credit. Remind us what this is and why it's in front of the courts.
Sure, Gemma. So this is a $50 million program. It's $50 million of that $450 million in priorities that the legislature set up last year that Clark referenced. And those are largely tax cuts in that the state is adjusting its rates and saying you don't have to pay as much on your income. This tax credit program for education specifically allows parents to write up to $5,000 in private education expenses on their, able to write that off on their state taxes starting this year. So parents have started applying for this program on January 15th. And the group that challenged the new law is called the Committee to Protect and Preserve the Idaho Constitution. They are a group of attorneys, and they challenged the tax credit on the grounds of the state constitution says the duty of the legislature is to maintain a thorough, uniform, free public system of schools. And the challengers argue that by setting up a secondary private system that is being subsidized by public funds through these tax credits, they argue that that is an impermissible violation of the Constitution, and they're asking the Idaho State Supreme Court to throw the program out.
Mm. And Logan, you actually talked with opponents and proponents of the tax credit after this hearing happened. What did each side have to say?
Sure, I spoke with Daniel Mooney, who is the president of that committee to protect and preserve the Idaho Constitution. He said that their attorneys did a great job arguing this in court. This would have been about a week ago exactly that this argument took place. They argue that the lack of accountability and standards in what what they're alleging is effectively a private system. Is basically the way that Idaho's tax credit has been set up, it specifically says that the state has no authority to regulate these private schools. There are only some requirements for which subjects they have to teach in order for parents to be eligible for the credit. And Mooney said this pollutes Idaho's public school system that the legislature is required to maintain. I also spoke with Chris Cargill, who's the president of the Mountain States Policy Center. They've been big supporters of this policy and worked actively on it during the legislative sessions. And he said that the petitioners have a pretty tough road to convince the court that this program should be thrown out. Unlike other states like California, who have very specific provisions in their constitution, like the California Constitution says public funds shall only be appropriated for public schools. Uh, Idaho's is less specific and only says the legislature has to maintain a system. So there was kind of the main thing that they were discussing in the courtroom was what exactly does A mean? Does it mean one and only
Mm-hmm.
one? Does it mean one and you can do other things if you feel like it? So it'll be interesting to see where the Supreme Court comes down on this, especially with how much deference they traditionally will show to the legislature when it comes to terms of making adjustments to tax policy, which is arguably what this piece of legislation is more so than an education policy.
So, Logan, what happens next?
The Supreme Court has taken this under advisement. We have our eyes on the court to see when they will release an opinion. I imagine that it won't be too long now, seeing as they took the case on an expedited timeline. And as I
Mm-hmm.
referenced, we've had about 2 weeks now where parents have been applying for the applications. We have applications on behalf of thousands of Idaho students. So if the court does strike this program down and rule it unconstitutional, I imagine that would be disappointing for the parents who've put in the work to start applying for this program. However, I am also pretty confident that if we get a thumbs up or thumbs down from the Supreme Court while the lawmakers are still in town and in session, if it was struck down, I don't think it would be surprising for lawmakers to take another run at it again, seeing how passionate folks have been about private education and the school choice arena. But of course, we're
Mm-hmm.
talking about this really tight budget year. These 2% additional holdbacks that we're talking about, that you were talking about with Clark earlier, those are so basically lawmakers have reopened the books for all of the budgets that they passed last year because revenue has come in short. So
Mm-hmm.
if we're looking at revenues uh, coming up short. I don't know that they have a lot of extra money to throw at restructuring a program. And also because it's a tax credit, it's not necessarily the state paying $50 million out. It is the
Mm-hmm.
state not collecting $50 million that they would have been collecting. It's
Mm-hmm.
a tough time. There's a lot of math.
Yeah.
The budgets are basically sucking up all the oxygen in the room at the state house this year.
They certainly are. So, Sarah, there has also been other news going on, in particular in light of the shooting death of a protester in Minnesota last week by federal agents. It's really sparking a lot of sharp divisions. I mean, even here in Idaho, and we're talking divisions with lawmakers and lawyers, even gun rights advocates are debating whether lawful gun possession can ever justify deadly force. And I know you've written about this since all of this happened last week. How are Idaho gun rights advocates reconciling their strong defense of concealed carry with arguments that the protester put himself at risk by being armed?
Yeah, that was basically our question, and we heard a whole range of answers. There were some folks like Representative Ted Hill, who has been very much a gun advocate in the state house. He said people who carry weapons have to be extra careful about how they communicate that to law enforcement. He personally said, he told me, up front, if he's pulled over, I've got a gun in the car or I've got one on me. So from his perspective, Alex Preddy, the protester who was shot, behaved sort of irresponsibly in that regard, which led to what Representative Hill called an unfortunate situation. On the other end of the spectrum, though, we had the Idaho Second Amendment Alliance and criminal defense attorneys who emphasized that what matters here legally is not whether the person is carrying a gun, but what they do with it during the interaction with law enforcement. Are they reaching for it, brandishing it, that kind of thing? And given that, based on the footage that's out there at the moment at least, Preddy appears to have just had the gun in its holster, these folks were saying that federal agents' actions really were egregious.
So, Sarah, I think it's fair to say that Idaho has not seen the kind of ice activity that Minneapolis has been seeing. However, can you tell us what kind of presence we have seen, and is it ticking up at all?
Yeah, so this is, to be honest, this is really my teammate Carolyn Comet-Solis's wheelhouse, but happy to share what she's found, which is that, immigration enforcement has increased in the state, though, as you said, not to the level certainly of what we're seeing in Minnesota and elsewhere. But we've seen agents using some increasingly aggressive tactics. We've had agents smashing car windows, conducting more arrests at routine ICE check-ins, pushing for immigrants' mandatory detention, and of course, as I'm sure you remember, back in October, FBI, ICE, and other federal agencies
Hmm.
raided a horse race out in Wilder and arrested over 100 immigrants. But yeah, definitely doesn't rise to the level of what we're seeing in Minnesota and elsewhere.
So, Sarah, the Idaho Statesman is publishing an ongoing series that's exploring how an influx of folks who are moving from California to Idaho are actually reshaping Idaho, and in particular, politics. So, what does the data show about how politically conservative Californians moving to Idaho actually are compared to longtime residents? And I ask this because there's an idea that, oh, if you're from California, you're super liberal, and then you're moving to Idaho.
Yes, I was going to say that the data that we found does definitely contradict sort of a general idea that's out there, but both survey and voter registration data suggests that the Californians who moved to Idaho overwhelmingly lean conservative, and yes, as you said, are turning the state more red. So as of June, I think it was about close to 80% of the registered voters in Idaho who were previously registered in California were Republican, and that's according to Secretary of State data. The survey data, in terms of the specific reasons that people moved and how those intersect with politics, can definitely be a little bit more squishy. We spoke with a Boise State professor who does public policy surveys, and he told us that newcomers to the area rarely specifically cited politics as an explicit reason for moving, but often their answers kind of correlated with conservative political leanings, like saying that they were moving for safety reasons or for a more family-friendly community.
What I thought was interesting in one of the articles that you and one of your colleagues wrote, Sarah, is that there is a gentleman who moved to Idaho in 2019. And apparently, a couple of years ago, he said, you know, I could care less if you moved here yesterday or if you're a fifth generation Idahoan. You know, he says, if you're a leftist, I want you to leave Idaho. And I would have a feeling that ruffles some feathers of longtime Idahoans.
Definitely. So yeah, that was a profile that we did of Ryan Spoon. He's a Republican activist and a leader. I think he's the vice chair of the Ada County Republican Party. And observers that we spoke to have kind of highlighted him as emblematic of a trend. Not that everybody takes the same approach, but that, as you said, he's taken this more maybe confrontational approach with folks who disagree with him, and has, even though he himself is a newcomer, has framed Idaho as kind of a haven for Republicans and conservatives, and wants to keep it that way. So he, online and elsewhere, urges people who lean more liberal from his perspective, at least, to leave the state. And kind of to that point, I think one thing that we kept hearing that was interesting is that there's not necessarily a huge divide between these old and new Republicans, speaking very broadly, but not a huge
Mhm.
divide in terms of policy positions, but maybe more of a divide in tactics or tone or approach, maybe less willingness to compromise from the newcomers.
So, Sarah, in the reporting that you've been doing, are these newcomers, changing policy outcomes, or is it mostly just changing maybe the tone and the tactics when it comes to political debate?
Yeah, we heard that, most of the change is probably more in that tones and tactics category, partially just, for the reason I mentioned that's the approach that folks are taking. But I think one thing we did also hear is that this maybe more aggressive approach is not always effective, at least, for example, with the state's current legislature, which one person I spoke to mentioned, the folks in the legislature are, I think he said, not an overly young group. And so maybe that's not a style that resonates with them, though he acknowledged as new folks move into the legislature, younger folks, we might see maybe more willingness to respond to that kind of outreach from activists or constituents.
Hmm.
But what I heard so
So,
far was it's not necessarily having a huge influence at that level.
so Sarah, you mentioned, longtime Idaho Republicans. How are the majority of them responding, to, I mean, really what feels more almost like a cultural influence, right? Of this kind of new wave of folks moving in and trying to kind of stir up this political debate.
Yeah, I definitely think we've seen some almost, head-to-head clashes, if that's not overstating it. I think that this new approach doesn't necessarily sit well with people who at least view themselves as folks who moved up, starting very small, maybe on local boards or city councils and worked their way up to, for example, the legislature. And I think there's a sense that these newcomers, don't have the same deep knowledge of the community concerns, whether that's in agriculture or in water. Um, and that, they're coming in and taking this pretty hardline stance, but they haven't kind of done their homework in terms of learning, how policies came to be the way they are. So we have seen some definitely direct clashes. In our story, we reference um, an interaction between Representative Stephanie Mickelson, who's I believe a seventh generation from a farm family that goes back quite
Hmm.
a long way in Idaho, who had kind of a direct confrontation with Ryan Spoon over whether or not her business was employing undocumented immigrants. So these things have kind of bubbled up in especially online spheres, but we are seeing some clashes.
So, I mean, I'm curious, Sarah. I mean, since there's a different approach, right, with these longtime Idaho Republicans versus folks who have maybe just moved in the last 5, 10 years, and their approach. I mean, and then you talk about this direct clash that happened. I mean, could this potentially start seeing some infighting within the GOP party? Because of the different approach to this type of political debate.
I think that we've very, very much so, yes. I think that's something that we've already started to see. I know when I was covering the Boise City and the Ada County beat, we were following the turnover in, I believe it was in October 2023, kind of all at once of the board of the Ada County Republican Party. And in part, they were protesting what they said were kind of oppressive tactics from the state party's leadership in terms of wanting almost purity tests or, you know, really being focused on folks' loyalty and kind of falling in line with a particular platform rather than allowing them to, you know, take their own beliefs and make the decisions that they felt appropriate. So I definitely think we've seen these differing styles clashing already, and I definitely think we'll see more of it.
So, Clark, Idaho's Chief Justice spoke before the legislature earlier this week, and one of the things he talked about, and he really warned lawmakers that threats and violence targeting judges and court staff are on the rise. Did he bring any, evidence? Did he share anything to show that threats against judges and court personnel are increasing?
Yeah, thanks, Gemma. I appreciate it. You're talking about Idaho Supreme Court Chief Justice G. Richard Bevan, who highlighted this, what he called as an increase in violent threats directed at judges, court personnel, elected officials in general. He used his annual State of the Judiciary speech to highlight this. And he told legislators threats directed at Idaho judges and courts have increased significantly in recent years. And most of these never materialize, but those that do require precautions that can disrupt court operations and delay the delivery of justice. And he gave a couple of examples. He was talking about he was talking about an incident that happened December 26th of last
Hmm.
year in Shoshone County near Wallace. There was a shooting that began outside of the Shoshone County Sheriff's Office there's in the immediate vicinity, the county courthouse and other government buildings are located there. KBOI and some other news organizations reported that 2 members of the public and 1 law enforcement officer were injured after the suspect began shooting outside of the Shoshone County Sheriff's Office, and then things moved inside, and the suspect was killed following a standoff with local law enforcement officers. That actually happened on December 26th, and so Justice Bevan pointed out that many of the county offices and the courts were closed that day, observing Christmas, but if they had not been, he talked about how disruptive and dangerous, how much more disruptive and dangerous it could have been than it already was. Also, the Idaho Judicial Branch has talked about a case last year where this was kind of fueled by social media, but following a plea agreement that was reached in a case where a defendant agreed to plead guilty to lesser charges to avoid a lengthy prison term. The Idaho State Judicial Branch put out a bunch of press releases in public service calling for an end to threats that the judge and the court personnel were receiving. They were talking about posts on social media trying to stalk and hunt down and punish the judge and the judge's family. And so this is something that judicial officials and public officials have been speaking out about for quite some time. Justice Bevan talked about this isn't unique to Idaho. In fact, unfortunately, we're seeing this across the country where elected officials or judges or public officials in some capacity are facing threats, and the threats of violence have the potential to disrupt these government services. And so this was something that he really highlighted during his speech to the legislature. He spoke to both the Idaho Senate and the Idaho House, and he talked about Idaho has a vested interest in protecting the court system, that Idahoans have an expectation that justice can be served and that this can be done in a peaceful and professional manner. And so he talked about all of us are invested in this. All of us have a stake in this. But to get back to what we were talking about at the very beginning of the show today, the budget cuts and the state revenue shortfall, Justice Bevan actually said, I don't have a specific request or a proposal for you this year, knowing that the budget is in the situation that it is, where we don't have the money that we want for all of our programs. But he challenged, Gemma, he challenged Idaho legislators to think about this, to reflect on this, and to spend some time developing longer range protocols and plans to ensure that the court system, the people participating in the court system, personnel and judges are able to do so with an expectation of safety, that justice will be delivered. And so while he recognized that there was a budget shortfall, he did not want the situation to go unnoticed. And he kind of issued a challenge to legislators. If they don't have the money this year, he wants them to be thinking about it in terms of long-term solutions and what they can do for the state of Idaho. So there's sort of an ellipsis at the end of it. It was sort of a challenge that was made to the legislature. He gave a couple of examples of threats and of specific examples of violence, and said all Idahoans need to care about this, and this needs to be on everybody's radar.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate the reporting on this, Clark. I want to bring in Heath Drusen into our discussion now. He is the host of the Extremely American podcast, and he'll be featured on Reveal. This is the weekly investigative public radio show and podcast. It'll be this Sunday night at 6, and then again on Thursday, February 5th on Boise State Public Radio. And he'll be talking about how Trump's immigration policies are impacting farmers right here in Idaho. Heath, nice to have you back on the show.
Great to be here, Gemma.
Okay, so Heath, how are Trump's immigration and tariff policies impacting Idaho farmers?
Well, as a lot of listeners probably know, the agriculture industry is very dependent on immigrant labor. Some of that labor is undocumented. Quite a lot of it is documented. It's a mix. But the vast majority of a lot of farms' labor pool is from other countries. And so this immigration crackdown that's going on, that we're seeing across the country with, ICE doing raids on businesses, on farms, and certainly we're seeing sort of mass ICE action in Minnesota right now. That all is affecting a lot of different businesses, but sort of inordinately affecting the agricultural industry. What's interesting in my reporting is that when these ICE operations happen, it's not just the farms that they raid. It kind of has a ripple effect where people hear about these raids, and even if they have proper documentation, even workers who are in the states legally, they're worried they're going to get caught up in those raids, and they might not show up to work for days even. They might lay low knowing that ICE is out there, um, because there have been a lot of people who have been rolled up in these raids who haven't done anything wrong, and maybe they get released later, but there's a lot of fear out there. And that's on top of these tariff policies that are sort of separate but related for agriculture, because a lot of farmers in Idaho, their products, some of them go overseas. And so when Trump is slapping tariffs on countries kind of willy-nilly, other countries respond in kind and say, okay, well, we're not going to buy some American goods, or we're going to slap tariffs on some American goods. And that cuts off foreign markets to some Idaho farmers and really hurts their bottom line. So it's a real double whammy.
Well, and so then, Heath, when we look at this, I mean, agriculture, farming, it is such an incredibly important industry here in Idaho. I mean, you just set that up for us there. But farmers, agriculture industry folks, tend to be a reliably conservative voting bloc. So, I mean, this kind of seems, I would think, to be a bit of a conundrum.
Right. And so, a lot of Americans probably think of the Midwest as sort of the farming belt, and Iowa, Nebraska, those two states are pretty consistently shown to be the most ag reliant states in the country. But Idaho's right up there. Idaho, depending on the numbers you look at, is in the top 5 of most ag reliant economies in the country. So it's a huge part of the state's economy. And if you just look at the Idaho legislature, you see that farmers and ranchers also have quite a big role in the leadership of the state, at least historically. And yes, farmers and ranchers in general, not always, but are a fairly conservative group of business owners. And so that's where there's a bit of a paradox here, where, these Trump policies are inordinately hurting Republican voters and, even Republican lawmakers who, especially in a part-time legislature like Idaho, their full-time business is farming and their part-time job is in the legislature. So it's really creating some mixed feelings among some folks who are like, well, I might support some of the stuff that Trump's doing, but some of what he's doing is just directly hurting my business. And I think some folks are trying to find a middle ground there.
So I know we talked briefly with Idaho Statesman reporter Sarah Cutler earlier on the show today, and we a little bit about this. But I want to go in deeper with you, because this has exposed a real rift within the state Republican Party. And in fact, you've got a pretty dramatic example for us, and we have a couple of sound bites we want to play. But can you set this up for us and just tell us who Stephanie Mickelson is?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in your last conversation, you guys talked a little bit about it, but Stephanie Mickelson is a Republican representative from Eastern Idaho, and she's also one of the largest potato farmers in the state. Mickelson Farms is one of the biggest spud operations in Idaho, which is saying something, of course, considering how important potatoes are to agriculture here. And, she's a conservative. She's got a lot of conservative bona fides. But she's been, relatively moderate on some immigration issues, and sharing her personal story about, the immigrant workers who help her on the farm. And, that caught the ire of another person you mentioned in the last segment, Ryan Spoon, this Ada County vice chair who's pretty far right. And when he heard Stephanie Mickelson talking about the humanity of her immigrant workers, well, he didn't like that. And he actually called ICE on her farm, and ICE raided her farm and ended up taking away an employee who had a years old criminal record. And that's, you're going to kind of hear her reaction to that.
We went out and we were working with ICE, being compliant with what they needed us to do. The guy comes out, tears coming down his face, watching him knowing that he will never come back in this country to ever see his children again. And that's sad.
And Keith, you've got another clip here where Mickelson actually says we're all immigrants.
Yeah, that's right. She hasn't backed down despite that, despite the raid, and this is her talking about how we need to be more welcoming of immigrants.
Immigrants aren't messing up the fabric of America. We're all immigrants. And when you see what they value and how they're willing to give their heart and souls to help you make a living, your appreciation and your understanding for an immigrant workforce completely changes versus somebody who has never had to really interact or deal with an immigrant workforce.
So, Heath, why? And I'm not wanting to say just Republicans, because we've seen infighting within the Democratic Party, in particular at the national level. But why in the world would Republicans do this to each other?
Well, there's been a growing hardline part of the party in Idaho. These far right folks, a lot of them have actually been coming in from out of state. Not all of them though, and they think that more moderate Republicans like Stephanie Mickelson are not Republicans at all. They call them rhinos, Republicans in name only, and they have this mission to kind of purify the party, and they want everybody to share their far right views. And they've been pretty aggressive in going after people like Stephanie Mickelson, who they see as not sufficiently conservative.
So very quickly, what does this mean for the future of the party here in Idaho?
Well, that's to be seen. And I think the May primaries, when a lot of these folks like Stephanie Mickelson are up for reelection and some far right people are trying to take them out, I think we'll really see how this fight is going, because there's a push and pull in the party. There's plenty of moderates who are pushing back, but the far right has been extremely aggressive, and May will tell us a lot about how that fight's going.
And Heath, before I let you go, can you tell us again how folks can listen to you on Reveal?
Yeah, absolutely. Tune into Boise State Public Radio Sunday night at 6 p.m., a replay Thursday at 10 p.m., or you can go online to reveal.org.
And as we continue our Reporter Roundtable, we're bringing in our reporter, George Prentice, who is also our Morning Edition host. He's been looking at the recent events in Minneapolis over the past few weeks, and he sat down with Dr. Sam Martin, the Frankenbethine Church Endowed Chair of Public Affairs, who wrote about the investigation into the death of a protester and about the First Amendment in the conversation. It's a nonprofit independent news organization. And George started off by asking Dr. Martin about a child's nursery rhyme. So let's take a listen.
What is swallow a fly logic?
So swallow a fly logic is something that I came up with a long time ago, 15 years ago, when I often teach First Amendment thinking and First Amendment jurisprudence. And one of the first things that we introduce with the First Amendment is the idea, many of us associate the First Amendment with the idea of critique. And very often elected officials don't like to be criticized. And that goes all the way back to, when we had kings and queens and that kind of thing. If a person criticized the king would worry that he was going to be lose the respect of the people. And if he lost the respect of the people, then the kingdom would fall. And so you were not allowed. It was a criminal penalty. People would sometimes be killed for speaking out against the king. And while we don't do that in the United States, sometimes we see a very similar logic that I tell my students is like swallow a fly logic, where I'm referring, of course, to the popular children's song where a woman eats a fly and then she keeps devouring bigger and bigger animals to try to take care of this fly that she swallowed until she tries to devour a horse, and that's too much and she ultimately dies. And what I say is that, people in power, people in government very often do this too, because they say something like, if someone says something or puts out a message that we don't like, gosh, people might believe it. They might be persuaded. And if people become persuaded, then they might stop supporting the president, the war, the project, even the government itself. And if nobody supports the government or the president, then their willingness to participate and to go along, that weakens. And if that weakens and the state falls, then there's no First Amendment, so who even cares? And so it's this kind of nihilistic train of thought that begins with, you have to respect, if you don't respect the president, you don't respect the governor, but you are partly responsible for the fact that democracy is going to fail. And it's a slippery slope that sort of follows that same logic of the old lady and the fly.
I keep thinking that 2026, through a political lens, is a year of this and that. In other words, it's tariffs and Greenland, or it's Canada and the lack of access to food stamps. Is it ICE? Is it the latest shooting? And is it just quite simply jobs? How much of a shadow might the most recent event in Minneapolis cast over the midterms? I know we're half a year away, but elections are won and lost somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, I mean, let me say first that I think that what's happening in Minneapolis with these tragic killings and the sort of collision between the Border Patrol and the citizens of Minneapolis, what we're seeing, I don't think, is a fight over a single incident. It's a fight over reality. When officials issue confident claims that quickly collide with what witnesses say they saw, or with video those witnesses take, or corrections that come down later, we're not just talking about damage to the record. We're talking about damage to the public's ability to trust that there's a sort of shared world that we're arguing about. And that, I think, takes us right to the question that you're asking about: what could all of this mean for the election that's going to happen here in 9 or 10 months? And I think the most realistic danger to the election coming up in November, I'm not worried so much about a dramatic cancellation or like the election not happening, so much as I worry about disruption and intimidation and administrative sabotage, and really the delegitimization that so often happens these days when one side does not come out on top in the election. This thing that, like, if I didn't win, that must mean that somebody played with the results, rather than just really believing that the people have the right to vote for whomever they want. I don't think anyone's be able to stop the election, but they sure can try to make people doubt it.
Yeah, we dehumanize in one moment, but that's a close cousin to disenfranchise.
I think the point of floating ideas like you shouldn't be prepared not to trust the vote in the upcoming election, or we may not even have it, we're going to cancel the election. The point is not about the legality of the election. I would encourage people to think what's happening when that goes on is permission, right? When a person says that, when a leader says that, and it enters our public conversation, then something unthinkable, like canceling an election, something unthinkable becomes normalized. And once that happens, all bets are off.
You say Minneapolis is not just a tragedy, it is a test.
Well, I think that the Minneapolis shootings, they are not only an argument about the use of force, or how much people are allowed to sort of confront or badger even public law enforcement and public officials. I think that they're a test about whether or not I think of truth as a public good. Right? We are all entitled to the truth of our government, just like so parks are a public good, and libraries are a public good, and roads are a public good. Well, so is truth. And this is a question right now about whether we still believe as a people in the United States that something is owed to us, even if it's hard information and even if tensions are very high. Because our democratic life depends on connection and agreement between citizens, between individuals, and between those individuals and the government. And that cooperation, that contract, that willingness to work together, it can't be sustained when there's not a sort of shared understanding of what has happened and a willingness to take accountability.
Can I ask, what course or courses are you teaching currently?
I have the good fortune to teach this semester. I'm teaching a course in political communication, which is really about how our leaders speak to us, how campaigns happen, and what good and ethical political communication looks like. And so we had quite a discussion yesterday in class about Minneapolis. Sort of fell off the syllabus a little bit, just trying to figure out really what it means to govern. Right. And we had a really great conversation yesterday about how we very often think of government these days as citizens, as I'm going to defend my side, or what are the political stakes, or what are the whatever stakes. But in moments like this, it's really good to remember that we're in a shared project to solve problems and make life possible and better for everyone. That requires a willingness to speak about hard questions, to say things are wrong when they're wrong, even if your side is the one who did it. what I tell my students is a good citizen is cynical. They're going to ask hard questions, but a good citizen isn't a nihilist who just believes that there's no solution possible, so I'm going to get as much as I want. It's been a really great semester. I've been glad to teach that class.
And a big thank you to our Reporter Roundtable. Our panelists today, Clark Corbin with Idaho Capital Sun, Logan Finney with Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television, Sarah Cutler with the Idaho Statesman, along with Heath Drusen, who is the host of Extremely American Podcast, and our very own George Prentice. This is the Idaho Matters Podcast. I'm Gemma Gaudet.
Looking for another podcast to listen to? Check out The Nature of Idaho from our partner station KISU in Eastern Idaho. Join hosts Peter Pruitt and Dr. Leif Tapanilla as they share fascinating stories from the Gem State's great outdoors, celebrating Idaho's wildlife, landscape, and natural wonders. That's The Nature of Idaho from KISU. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.